Identifying plants in the wintertime can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes your twigs are out of reach, or you're looking for a more definitive characteristic that helps you identify your plant species. Well, in this video, I'm going to share 8 wintertime characteristics that I use to perform speedy but accurate plant identifications. Now, starting from the beginning, we all know that autumn is a time when deciduous trees lose their leaves and they remain barren during the wintertime until spring. Well, that's not always true, and just like everything in biology, there's always an exception. Oak trees will retain their leaves to the wintertime, although some oak trees are better than their relatives at retaining their leaves. When a tree retains its leaves to the wintertime, it's known as marcescent. Now, this tree back here is a shingle oak, and it's pretty good at retaining its leaves, and that's awesome news for us because shingle oaks have pretty distinctive leaves amongst oaks. Now, let me show you what its leaf looks like. Its leaf is single-lobed, so it looks like an oval or an egg shape. And typically, oak trees are lobed, and they're separated into about 5 or 9 lobes, so it looks sort of like this. All right, so pretty different from a shingle oak leaf. Now, typically in the wintertime, if you see leaves on a tree, it's gonna be an oak tree. However, there are a few exceptions, like sugar maples and Norway maples. They'll hold on to a very few of their leaves during the wintertime. And also sycamores, they'll hold on to a few of their leaves during the wintertime. But if you're looking at a sycamore, typically you'll know that it's a sycamore before you look at its leaves, but we're gonna get to that later. Now, leaves aren't the only thing that plants will hold on to. Some will keep their fruits attached. Here we have some legumes that are hanging from a Kentucky coffee tree. If we take a look at one of these legumes, they're quite distinctive. They're this dark brown color. They're pretty hard and woody. And if you were going to try to open it, you first probably hurt yourself. But if you did manage to get it open, you notice that there are some giant dark brown seeds inside, and they're covered in a sticky goo. And that's how you know that you have a Kentucky coffee tree. This next tree, a lot of you probably have in your yard. It's very difficult to miss. This is none other than the Sweetgum tree. They produce these spiky balls of capsules. They're known as spike balls or gum balls. And we can see that they're actually all over the ground. And not only that, but they also are all in the branches as well. So if you see these gumballs lining the ground or in the branches, then you have yourself a sweetgum tree. The presence of thorns, prickles, or stipular spines can be a dead giveaway when trying to identify a species. However, I am not going to lay out the big differences between a thorn, a prickle, or a stipular spine, so I'm just going to refer to them all as sharp outgrowths. All right, so here we have a multiflora rose bush, and it still has its fruits present. And we could use this characteristic as a way to identify the species, but we're not going to do that. We're actually going to look at these nice, sharp, curved prickles or outgrowths, all right? And we can see that they completely line this stem, all right? And not only do they line the stem, but they also will line the bark. Another species that can be identified using its sharp outgrowths is the black locust. Here's a twig of a black locust, and you can see that it has 2 sharp outgrowths or stipular spines emerging from each node. So if you find a plant and it has 2 sharp outgrowths emerging in pairs, then you have yourself a black locust. Form or stature is another characteristic that I recommend using when you're trying to make plant identification. And what I mean by form or stature is to determine whether or not you're dealing with a tree or a shrub. Now, what I recommend doing is to quickly learn as many of the shrubs in your area as possible, because then you know if you're dealing with a shrub or you're dealing with a tree or maybe a young tree such as like a sapling. Okay, because shrubs and saplings can get confused pretty easily. All right, but if you know all your shrubs, then you know, hey, I am not dealing with a sapling. All right, but what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a common shrub in my area. We're going to take a look at spicebush. Okay, so here we've got a spicebush. And how do I know that this is a spicebush? All right, so one thing that gives away that it might be a spicebush is I'm going to take a look at its bark. And the bark is very shiny. It has a shiny warty lenticels on it. All right, and it's also quite smooth besides those lenticels. All right. Now, there's an invasive species called autumn olive that also has bark with shiny, warty lenticels. All right, and it's also pretty smooth as well. So, how do I distinguish a spice bush from an autumn olive? Well, spice bush has another characteristic that is pretty unique to spice bush. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a twig off of the spice bush and we're going to give it a sniff. And when I do that, this spice bush has a very nice aroma. To me, it smells like a mixture of like a bunch of fall spices, like cinnamon, allspice, nutmeg, like all of those. And when I smell that, I'm like, okay, this is a spice bush. Because if you were to break an autumn olive twig and sniff it, it's not going to smell like those spices. So now I know for sure that I've got myself a spice bush twig. This is a tulip tree, and tulip trees have a scent that's very similar to that of spice bush, and that's why form and stature are important to consider. However, tulip trees have a very distinctive characteristic, and that is when their fruits disperse, they leave behind what looks like a wooden flower in the branches. So if you see what looks like a wooden flower in the branches of a tree, then you have yourself a tulip tree. Bark is one of the best characteristics to use to make quick identifications, especially in the wintertime, because you can just scan the forest and find the exact species that you're looking for. Now, a few species actually have bark that's so distinct that you don't need any other characteristics to identify them. This right here is a hackberry, and hackberries have very distinct bark. Their bark is gray, it has this smooth background, and it has these nice warty bumps. All right, or corky ridges, I should say. Now, to me, this looks sort of like a witch's nose. All right, and that's sort of how I remember it. But yeah, this is a very distinct bark, and no other bark in the area is going to look like a hackberry. Here we have our second tree. This is a sycamore, and we can see that it has these irregular scaly blocks at its base, but we don't really care about the base. As you move up the tree, these scaly blocks will fall off, revealing a smooth sort of molted white, green, brown sort of camouflage appearance, which is really cool. The last characteristic I want to tell you about is to look at the habitat the species is in. For instance, here are some black willows that are in almost completely saturated soil. And this is ideal conditions for them. And these black locusts aren't found anywhere else on campus, just in this one spot. Now, there are some species that are at the opposite end of the spectrum and prefer only really dry soils that can't be flooded whatsoever. Now, this characteristic, along with all the other characteristics I mentioned in this video, are very important to consider altogether. So I hope you do that next time you're making one of your plant identifications. All right, I hope that you enjoyed learning about these 8 wintertime characteristics with me, and I hope that you found at least 1 or 2 of them useful. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you all in my next video.